It did not begin with a battle. It began with absence. Settlements that had stood for generations were found abandoned. Roads that once carried merchants and pilgrims now carried nothing at all. In some places, the silence came first. In others, it followed smoke rising slowly into sky, evidence not chaos, but of something far more deliberate. Entire regions along the eastern frontiers of Europe began to empty before any army had formally declared war. The reports, when they arrived, were inconsistent. Some spoke of riders who moved faster than any force previously recorded. Others described disciplined formations that did not behave like raiders, but like something far more organized, something that did not simply pass through territory, but erased resistance with methodical precision. What made these accounts difficult to process was not just their brutality, but their coherence. There was no clear line of advance, no singular front, no conventional pattern of invasion, only pressure. By the early months of 1241, that pressure had reached the fragmented political landscape of Central Europe. The Kingdom of Poland, divided among regional rulers and noble factions, found itself exposed, not because it lacked manpower, but because it lacked unity. Authority was distributed, loyalties were conditional, and coordination depended on cooperation that could not be guaranteed under stress. At the center of this unstable structure stood Henry II of Silesia. He was not the most powerful ruler in Europe, nor the most experienced. But in that moment, he became something more important, a point of convergence. Messages from the east described forces that had already broken through the principalities of Rus. Hungarian scouts reported devastation along their own borders. The scale of the threat was no longer speculative. It was advancing. Henry's position forced a decision that could not be delayed. To wait meant allowing the invader to penetrate deeper, to choose its own ground, to divide already fragile alliances. To act meant assembling an army under conditions that were far from ideal, an army composed not of unified command, but contingents drawn from different regions, languages, and expectations. Still, the decision was made. Summons were issued across Silesia, Greater Poland, and neighboring territories. Knights answered, bound by obligation as much as conviction. Alongside them came levies, infantry with limited training, but essential numbers. Foreign elements joined as well. Military orders, including contingents of the Knights Templar and Teutonic Knights, responded to the call, bringing with them experience in disciplined warfare, though not in confronting an enemy of this kind. On paper, the force that gathered appeared formidable. Heavy cavalry formed its core, armored knights trained for shock combat, capable of breaking formations through direct assault. Infantry provided support, holding ground and reinforcing flanks. The presence of religious military orders added an element of cohesion and professionalism that might compensate for the broader army's fragmentation. But cohesion on paper is not cohesion in motion. These forces had not trained together. Their command structures overlapped but did not fully align. Communication between contingents depended on messengers moving across distances that, in the heat of battle, could become barriers rather than links. And most critically, their understanding of the enemy remained incomplete. The Mongol forces approaching from the east were not a single mass, but a coordinated system of movement. They did not rely on overwhelming numbers at a single point. Instead, they advanced through multiple columns, each capable of independent operation, each contributing to a broader strategy that was not immediately visible to those facing it. Reconnaissance was central to their approach. Scouts moved ahead of the main force, gathering information not just about terrain, but about reaction. They observed how quickly local authorities mobilized, how roads were used, where resistance formed, and where it did not. What they encountered in Poland confirmed what had already been observed elsewhere: fragmentation. The Mongol advance did not aim to engage the entire region at once. Instead, it applied pressure selectively, drawing responses, testing reactions, and isolating forces that could be engaged under controlled conditions. By the time Henry II began concentrating his army, Mongol units had already penetrated deep into Polish territory. Towns such as Sandomierz had fallen. Defensive positions had been bypassed or dismantled. The speed of the advance disrupted not only logistics, but perception. There was no stable front line, no clear indication of where the main threat would emerge. This uncertainty shaped every decision that followed. Henry could not afford to disperse his forces across multiple locations. To do so would invite defeat in detail. Smaller units isolated and overwhelmed before they could reinforce one another. Instead, he chose concentration. He would gather his forces into a single army, move to intercept, and force a decisive engagement. It was a logical decision, but it was also one the Mongols had anticipated. To them, concentration was not a threat. It was an opportunity. A single army, once located, could be fixed, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed, provided the conditions were controlled. And controlling conditions was precisely what they had been preparing to do. As Henry's army moved toward the region of Legnica, the landscape itself became a factor in the unfolding strategy. The terrain was not mountainous nor heavily forested, but it was not open in a way that allowed unrestricted maneuver either. Rolling ground, patches of woodland, and river systems created natural channels, routes that could be used to guide movement or to restrict it for a conventional European army. This terrain was manageable. It allowed for deployment of cavalry, formation of infantry lines, and the establishment of defensive positions if necessary. For the Mongols, it offered something more. Control. They did not need to hold ground in the traditional sense. They needed to shape how their opponent moved across it, to influence decisions before the battle had even begun. Reports reaching Henry suggested that the Mongol forces ahead of him were smaller than expected. Skirmishes indicated limited numbers. Some detachments appeared to withdraw rather than engage directly. To a commander seeking to force battle, these signs could be interpreted as weakness, or at least as hesitation. But the pattern was consistent. Advance, contact, withdrawal, not retreat and disorder, but withdrawal and control. Each engagement provided information about how quickly Henry's forces reacted, how aggressively they pursued, how they maintained formation under pressure. By the time the two forces approached proximity near Legnica, the Mongols had already learned a great deal about the army they were about to face. They understood its composition, they understood its strengths, and more importantly, they understood its vulnerabilities. Henry, on the other hand, faced a more difficult problem. He had assembled a force large enough to confront the enemy, but he had done so under conditions of uncertainty. His intelligence was limited, his allies were not fully integrated, and the enemy's intentions remained unclear. Still, delay was no longer an option. If he did not engage, the Mongols would continue to advance, bypassing strong points, avoiding static defenses, and striking where resistance was weakest. The longer they remained unchallenged, the more they would dictate the pace and direction of the campaign. So he moved forward. The decision to seek battle at Legnica was not made out of confidence, but necessity. It was an attempt to impose order on a situation that was becoming increasingly unstable. What Henry could not fully see was that the conditions he was stepping into had already been shaped, not by chance, but by design. And as his army advanced into position, forming lines, aligning contingents, and preparing for engagement, the Mongol forces ahead did not present themselves as a unified front. They appeared fragmented, dispersed, almost vulnerable. But beneath that appearance, movement continued, coordinated, deliberate, and concealed within the very gaps it created. The battlefield was not yet engaged, but the outcome was already beginning to take form. By the time the armies came within sight of one another, the imbalance was no longer numerical. It was structural. Henry II's force had achieved what few in the region could manage: concentration. Knights from Silesia, contingents from Greater Poland, Moravian reinforcements, and disciplined elements of the military orders stood together in a single formation. Armor glinted across the field, banners marked noble affiliations, and the presence of heavily equipped cavalry gave the army a sense of solidity, weight that could be directed forward. But solidity does not guarantee control. The army was arranged in multiple lines, each reflecting not a unified doctrine, but the identities of the forces within it. At the front stood the knights, those expected to carry the momentum of the engagement. Behind them, supporting contingent prepared to reinforce or exploit breakthroughs. Infantry formed a less visible but necessary layer, intended to stabilize ground and maintain cohesion if the advance faltered. Command, however, was distributed rather than centralized. Henry held overall authority, but individual leaders retained influence over their own contingents. Orders would move, but interpretation would vary. Timing, in such a structure, becomes uncertain. Across the field, the Mongol force presented a different image. There was no dense formation, no single line that invited direct comparison. Instead, groups of mounted units moved with space in between them, maintaining distance while preserving alignment. Their formation was not defined by proximity, but by coordination. At their center operated commanders who had already demonstrated the effectiveness of their method across vast distances. Among them were Baidar and Khadan, leaders tasked not with conquering territory in isolation, but with executing a broader campaign, one that required synchronization with simultaneous operations in Hungary and beyond. Their objective at Legnica was not territorial control. It was disruption. The European forces gathering in Poland posed a potential threat, not because of their immediate strength, but because of what they represented. If allowed to consolidate further, they could form a coordinated resistance capable of slowing or even halting the Mongol advance into Central Europe. That possibility had to be removed. The engagement at Legnica, therefore, was not a reaction. It was preemption. As the distance between the two forces narrowed, the first movements were initiated not by Henry's army, but by the Mongols. Light cavalry advanced, maintaining a range that kept them beyond immediate engagement while still within visibility. Arrows began to fall, not in concentrated volleys, but in measured, persistent fire. This was not an attempt to break the enemy. It was an attempt to provoke it. For European heavy cavalry, trained in decisive engagement, prolonged exposure to harassment carried a psychological cost. To remain stationary under missile fire without response risked erosion of morale. To advance promised resolution, a chance to close distance and bring the fight into a form they understood. The Mongols understood this pressure. They had designed it. Initial contact escalated as forward elements of Henry's army began to push outward. The knights, responding to both command and instinct, advanced to drive off the skirmishers. Their movement was controlled at first, formation maintained, pace measured. The Mongols responded with withdrawal, not sudden, not disordered, measured. They yielded ground while continuing to fire, maintaining just enough distance to avoid direct engagement. Each step backward extended the field, drawing the advancing units further from their original lines. From Henry's position, the development appeared favorable. The enemy was giving ground. Momentum was building. But momentum, once initiated, is difficult to regulate. As the front line advanced, the spacing between units began to shift. Coordination required constant adjustment. Signals relayed, formations corrected. Yet, under the pressure of engagement, perfect alignment became impossible. Some contingents pressed harder than others. Some maintained discipline. Others interpreted withdrawal as opportunity. The line began to stretch. Behind them, supporting units attempted to maintain cohesion. But the pace of movement was dictated by the front. What had begun as a controlled advance gradually transformed into a pursuit. And pursuit, in this context, was precisely the transition the Mongols required. Their withdrawal continued, but its direction was not arbitrary. It followed a path that gradually reoriented the battlefield, subtly shifting the axis of engagement. The European forces, focused on the immediate objective of closing distance, adjusted without fully recognizing the cumulative effect. They were no longer advancing on their own terms. They were being guided. At a critical moment, the Mongol formation altered. Units that had been withdrawing began to separate further, creating apparent gaps. To an advancing force, such gaps suggested fragmentation, an enemy losing cohesion under pressure. For commanders seeking decisive engagement, this was a moment to intensify the attack. Elements of Henry's army accelerated. The front line, already extended, pushed deeper into the space ahead. Communication with the rear became strained, not broken, but delayed. Orders issued from the center took longer to reach the edges. The synchronization required for a coordinated maneuver began to degrade. It was at this point that the battlefield environment began to assert itself. The ground, while not impassable, introduced irregularities that affected movement. Slight elevations disrupted line of sight. Patches of terrain limited the ability of units to maintain lateral awareness. What had been a broad, visible formation became segmented. Not entirely, but enough to reduce mutual support. The Mongols, operating in smaller, coordinated units, adapted seamlessly. They did not require continuous visual contact across the entire line. Their communication relied on signals, flags, horns, prearranged maneuvers that allowed them to operate as a system even when dispersed. At the moment when European forces were most extended, most committed to forward motion, the Mongol response shifted from evasion to engagement, not at the center, at the edges. Flanking units that had remained outside the immediate line of retreat began to close inward. Their movement was rapid, controlled, and synchronized. Arrows intensified, not as scattered harassment, but as concentrated fire directed at exposed segments. Simultaneously, elements that had been in withdrawal slowed, just enough to reduce the distance between themselves and the advancing forces. The gap narrowed. The space that had invited pursuit began to contract. For the knights at the front, the realization did not come immediately. Engagement had intensified, but the expectation of breakthrough remained. The enemy, though resisting, still appeared within reach. But behind them, the structure of the army was changing. The stretched line, once a sign of forward momentum, now represented vulnerability. Units that had advanced more aggressively found themselves ahead of support. Communication with adjacent contingents weakened. The ability to respond to developments beyond immediate sight diminished. And as the Mongol units closed from the flanks, the geometry of the battlefield shifted. What had been a forward advance began to resemble encirclement, not complete, not yet, but forming. The first signs of disorder appeared not as collapse, but as hesitation. Commands issued from the center encountered delay. Signals conflicted with immediate perception. Some units attempted to maintain the advance. Others began to slow, sensing the change but unable to fully interpret it. This divergence in response was enough. The Mongols did not need to break the entire army at once. They needed to fracture its cohesion, to create conditions where coordination failed, where individual units acted without synchronization. Under those conditions, even a large force could be dismantled. As pressure increased from the flanks, the volume of missile fire rose. Arrows struck not only men, but horses, the critical element of heavy cavalry. A dismounted knight lost not just mobility, but the ability to rejoin formation effectively. Gaps began to appear, small at first, then widening. Still, the core of Henry's army held. At the center, the banners remained visible. Command had not collapsed. Orders continued to be issued, attempts made to stabilize the line, to reassert control over the advancing elements and draw them back into cohesion. But the battlefield was no longer static. It was being reshaped in motion, and the point at which correction remained possible was already beginning to close. The Mongol forces, having drawn their opponent into extension, now prepared to complete the transition from controlled engagement to decisive containment. What followed would not be a sudden reversal. It would be a tightening, gradual, deliberate, and irreversible. The moment of collapse did not arrive as a single event. It emerged through accumulation. Pressure, applied with precision, had already begun to alter the structure of Henry's army. What remained intact at the center was no longer supported by what had once extended from it. Units that had advanced with confidence now found themselves separated, not entirely surrounded, but no longer part of a coherent whole. The Mongol forces did not rush this transition. They narrowed it from the flanks. Mounted archers maintained distance while intensifying fire. From the front, the withdrawing units slowed further, reducing the space in which the European advance could maneuver. The battlefield, once open, now felt constrained not by terrain alone, but by the positioning of the enemy. At this stage, visibility became a decisive factor. Accounts from the engagement describe the use of smoke, whether from deliberate deployment or the natural byproduct of burning material carried by the Mongols is debated, but its effect is less uncertain. The air thickened, lines of sight shortened. Signals, already strained by distance, became difficult to interpret. In an army dependent on visual coordination, this mattered. Command requires clarity. Movement requires awareness. Without them, even disciplined units began to act on immediate perception rather than centralized direction. For Henry II, positioned near the core of the formation, the situation was shifting faster than it could be corrected. Orders to consolidate, to regroup, to reestablish alignment. These required time to propagate, time that was no longer available. The Mongols had no such constraint. Their system did not depend on maintaining a single continuous line. Their units operated within a shared framework of intent, allowing them to adapt fluidly as conditions changed. Where one group applied pressure, another exploited the response. Where resistance formed, it was not met head-on, but redirected, drawn into positions where to be isolated. It was in this environment that the turning point took form, not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a loss of cohesion across multiple points simultaneously. Forward elements of Henry's army, having advanced beyond effective support, found themselves engaged from multiple directions. Attempt to push through the front met with continued withdrawal, never allowing decisive contact. Attempts to turn and address flanking pressure disrupted formation further, exposing additional vulnerabilities. Behind them, supporting units encounter conflicting demands. Advance to reinforce. Hold position to maintain structure. Withdraw to avoid encirclement. Each option carried risk, and without synchronized execution, each contributed to fragmentation. The army did not collapse all at once. It separated. Small groups, still intact internally, began to lose connection with one another. The battlefield became a series of localized engagements rather than a unified confrontation. In such conditions, numerical advantage loses its meaning. Strength cannot be concentrated if it cannot be coordinated. The Mongols understood this principle. They did not seek to overwhelm the entire force directly. Instead, they reduced it piece by piece, segment by segment. Units that became isolated were targeted with focused pressure. Arrow fire softened resistance. Rapid movements prevented regrouping. Where necessary, close engagement followed, but only when conditions favored it. At the center, Henry attempted to stabilize what remained. His position, marked by banners and surrounded by his retinue, represented not just command, but continuity. As long as the center held, there remained the possibility, however limited, of reconstituting the army, of withdrawing an order, of preserving a force capable of future resistance. But the conditions required for such a recovery were no longer present. Communication had degraded beyond reliability. The flanks were no longer secure. The forward elements could not be recalled without exposing the center further. Every attempt to impose order encountered a battlefield that had already shifted beyond centralized control. It was at this point that Mongol forces closed the remaining distance, not as a single charge, but as converging movements, tightening the space around the central contingent. The same mobility that had drawn the European army forward now allowed for rapid repositioning, compressing what remained of its structure. The effect was cumulative. Pressure from multiple directions reduced maneuverability. Missile fire continued, targeting both men and horses. Fatigue, already present from prolonged engagement, began to take hold. Armor that provided protection in direct combat became a burden under constant movement and harassment. The center held, for a time, but holding, in isolation, does not reverse collapse. Eventually, the perimeter began to break, not through a singular breach, but through the gradual erosion of resistance. As individual groups were overwhelmed or forced apart, the space available to the remaining forces diminished. The ability to maintain formation disappeared. What had once been an organized line became a cluster, still resisting, but no longer capable of coordinated action. Henry II remained within this collapsing structure. His presence did not alter the outcome, but it defined its conclusion. The death of a commander in such a context is not merely symbolic. It marks the final dissolution of command authority. When Henry fell, the last point of cohesion within the army disappeared with him. What followed was not a pursuit in the conventional sense. It was a continuation. The Mongols did not scatter in uncontrolled pursuit. They maintained their structure, extending pressure where resistance persisted, disengaging where it did not. The battlefield, once defined by opposing armies, became defined by the absence of one. By the end of the engagement, The army that had assembled at Legnica no longer existed as a functional force. Its remnants were dispersed. Its command structure was gone. Its ability to reorganize had been removed. The destruction was not total in a literal sense. Survivors remained, some escaped, but as an organized military body, it had been eliminated. The significance of this outcome extended beyond the immediate battlefield. The forces that had gathered under Henry represented more than a regional defense. They were an early attempt at coordinated resistance against an advancing system of warfare that operated on different principles. Their defeat demonstrated not just the effectiveness of Mongol tactics, but the limitations of the structures opposing them. At Legnica, the imbalance was not in courage, nor even in numbers. It was in adaptability. The Mongol approach, mobility, coordination, controlled engagement, and strategic manipulation of the battlefield, proved capable of dismantling a force that, under different conditions, might have held its ground.